Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos weekly for a couple different reasons. First of all, it's just to kind of take my brain out of the background prep mode as I work with the text through the week and move it into the mode of actually writing and preparing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. And the second reason is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason, whether you're a regular viewer or if you just happen to find this one, to gain some different insight into the gospel text for the week. That being said, this particular Sunday, which is February 7th, 2016, Transfiguration Sunday, the final Sunday of Epiphany for this year, the gospel lesson comes out of Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 36. And of course, as the name of the Sunday, Transfiguration Sunday, it's the story of Jesus' transfiguration. This is one that is featured every year. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have this story, so we take it from the different gospel for each year. And it always falls on the final Sunday of Epiphany, just before Ash Wednesday and the start of Lent. That's just kind of the way the lectionary works, brings it up every year. So this is a story that's pretty familiar, very fitting to happen during Epiphany as Jesus is continuously revealed to the world, oftentimes through his divine ability to perform miracles, other times with some sort of divine proclamation, oftentimes from the voice of God. For instance, his baptism, which kind of kicks off Epiphany. And now this one at the end, again, that's the same as we hear the voice of God once more saying, "This is my son." So that's kind of just a little brief background of the Transfiguration and what's going on there and why we have it during this season before we jump into Lent and move ourselves towards Holy Week and Easter here towards the end of March. So that's kind of where we're at year-wise. That being said, let's go ahead and jump in. It starts off now about 8 days after these sayings, basically saying approximately a week after Jesus has been doing some teaching and stuff. And some think that the presence of 8 days indicates that it's a Sunday. Okay, I don't know if that's really what it's saying or not, but it's anyway. So stuff has been going on, and now we're fast forwarding about a week. So Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went on the mountain to pray. Okay, so something like this is pretty common. Jesus would oftentimes withdraw from the crowds and pray, and sometimes he would go by himself, sometimes he would go with the 12 disciples, and they'd be in the group. In this particular case, he takes Peter, James, and John. Oftentimes I call these guys the big three because they oftentimes seem to be invited by Jesus to witness certain special situations, certain experiences. Now, why it's these three, we don't know. There's definitely some different theories. Some think that it's Peter because you are the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. Some think that these three will kind of embody the core of the authority or perhaps the leadership once Jesus ascends to heaven, and they're kind of the head of the church. Some think John because he's considered by many to be the beloved disciple. Others think that it's because these three were among Jesus' first called disciples, along with Peter's brother Andrew. If that's the case, why isn't Andrew included in these? I mean, we don't exactly know, but regardless, the big three, as I call them, are oftentimes privy to situations kind of like this. So regardless, Jesus is going up the mountain to pray, something he often did, and he takes these three guys with him. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Now here's the transfiguration itself. We don't know exactly what it looks like. The only thing that we can extrapolate, that's a big word that I don't usually use, the only real thing that we can figure is something about him changed, and it says it right here. His face was changed. So something about his appearance looks different. And we hear that his clothes became dazzling white. Something I like in the Greek, it talks about how his clothes flashed white like lightning. And that's pretty bright. It's pretty extreme. Anyone who's ever happened to look closely at a lightning bolt that hit nearby knows that it's really, really bright. So So that kind of gives us a sense of what the disciples are seeing as they see Jesus changed, transfigured, whatever that means, whatever that looks like. So in short, I always tend to say or tend to think that in the transfiguration, the divine nature of Jesus actually became visible through the human nature of Jesus. We confess and believe that Jesus was fully man and fully God at the same time, which is like what? But in this instance, the divine nature, not just the divine power, divine ability in say his miracles, but his divine form, his divine person, his divine nature shines through the human in this instance, and that's kind of what's going on here. Suddenly, they, being the big three, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to Jesus. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Okay, so this whole deal goes on, and suddenly we see Moses and Elijah show up. Now, Moses and Elijah are certainly representatives, if you want to say that, of the law. Of course, God gave the law to Moses, who then gave it to the Israelites. And then the prophets, of which Elijah is considered to be the greatest of the prophets, but certainly not the only one. But these two represent two very important aspects of the Jewish scriptures, the law and the prophets. The law, which was given to them to help define relationship or guide relationship between one another and between humanity and God. And then the prophets, who were the voice of God, speaking to the people, oftentimes a word of rebuke, but oftentimes a word of hope as well. So these are two very important things. Another interesting aspect of considering these two guys, Moses was the one who talked to God face to face, like as friends would talk to one another. So he has a very unique aspect there. He has, of course, died long since. So for him to be there, this is a person who has now experienced whatever it is that comes after death. And that's a big deal. Now, Elijah, on the other hand, was taken into heaven alive, did not experience death. One of only two characters within the Bible that we hear experience this. There's one other guy who does too, and don't ask me his name because I'm blanking on it. But taking into heaven without experiencing death. So we have two very unique individuals who have had different experiences of life beyond this life, and they're here talking with Jesus. And Luke is kind of unique in this regard that we hear the subject of what they're talking about. Matthew and Mark don't tell us, but Luke tells us that they're speaking of Jesus' departure, which would be his crucifixion and death and resurrection, and then ascension back to heaven, which will all occur in and around Jerusalem in the days to come. Following this scripture-wise, or gospel-wise, I should say, Jesus turns his face towards Jerusalem, and the rest of the gospel is he's going towards there intentionally, or he's then there. So that's kind of what's going on, but they're speaking to him of the fulfillment of what he will do, the fulfillment of his departure that's coming at Jerusalem. Important little note that I'll kind of come back around to later. So that's what they're talking about. Okay, let's continue. Now, Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, or sometimes that could also be translated as when they became awake or when they were fully awake, because they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood there with them. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. Okay, so they've climbed a mountain. The guys are tired. It happens. And their human frailty kicks in. Their human weakness. Their human, just the frailty is probably the best word to use. The frailty of our human bodies kicks in. They need rest. They're tired. And so they either go to sleep or they're very drowsy, and that's kind of ambiguous, but they almost sleep through this amazing situation, this amazing experience, this amazing thing that happens to and with and around Jesus. But they do see it. And but it's confusing to them, and it would be if suddenly this person that you know, their face changes and their clothes flash like lightning, and then suddenly these two dead guys show up, or one dead, whatever. These two uh, important people show up and they're talking about things. You'd probably be a little confused too, just like Peter is. But he says it is good that we're here. What I kind of like about this is that is ambiguous in the original language too. I've always kind of taken it that it's good that the four of us are here, Jesus and Peter and James and John. But this time I kind of almost took it, it's good that the three of us are here. And there are three of you. There's you, Jesus, and Moses, and Elijah. So we'll each build you guys a tent so that we can stay here. Regardless of how we see that, basically it's that mountaintop experience. Something amazing is happening up the mountain, and we want to stay there. It's good for us to be here. We know that that doesn't happen, and they eventually go back down the mountain again. But regardless, Peter, who's always the impulsive one, and he's always portrayed that way, is the one to speak up, even though he doesn't know what he's talking about, and he doesn't know what he's saying. He's just kind of like, I gotta say something. One of those guys who needs to fill the silence. So he has said that, or he says this to them. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one of any of the things that they had seen. All right, so that's the end of the lesson there. So while Peter is making this bonehead statement, which seems kind of boneheaded, and at the same time kind of seems to make sense. Like, well, yeah, this is kind of cool. Let's stay here. Clearly, this is a holy place. This cloud comes over them, and we hear that they're terrified. Now, are they terrified because it's a glorious cloud of God? Maybe. Are they terrified because they're up on a mountain and weather is rolling in? Maybe. I've been on a mountain when that's happened, and yeah, it's kind of scary. So I can relate to that. Either way, they're afraid, and they enter into this cloud. Now, maybe the cloud completely envelops them. It's such a thick fog that they can't even see one another. Maybe not. It doesn't really tell us. But either way, this cloud comes over them, and the voice comes out of the cloud. "This is my son," the voice of God, proclaiming once more, "This is my son." The chosen one is worded just a little differently than it is in Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark both say, "This is my beloved son." Here it says chosen, and honestly, I'll admit to you, I don't know quite what to make of that. What is the difference between chosen and beloved? There's certainly similar in nature, but they've got a different connotation to them. So I don't know, but that's what God says. And then he says, "Listen to him." And then once the voice happens, the cloud lifts, and Moses and Elijah are gone. Jesus is there alone. We don't know if he still looks different, transfigured, or if he's kind of gone back to the way he normally looks. It doesn't tell us that. But either way, Jesus is there alone with the men. And another difference here with Luke compared to Matthew and Mark. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus tells the three guys not to say anything about this for the time being, to not share it. And that's the first thing that he says when God says, "Hey, this is my son, listen to him." That's the first thing he says is, "Don't tell anyone about this." Not in this case. If you notice, Jesus didn't say anything, and the disciples just keep quiet about it. They don't talk about it. Actually, the first thing that we hear from Jesus is in the next little portion of the extra reading, which I'm not including. They come back down the mountain, and there they encounter a man who's brought his son, who's possessed with a evil spirit. And the other disciples have been trying to throw it out of him or cast it out, and they can't do it. And so they come to Jesus, and Jesus almost gets a little frustrated, and he says, let's see. The man says, "I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not." Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." And then he heals him. But the first thing he says refers to the fact that he's got limited time here on earth, and that he is not just here to cast out demons. He's not just here to heal diseases, though he does a lot of that. That's not the purpose for him being here. And so he speaks of his departure, which, if you remember, was what Moses and Elijah were talking about. So we kind of see it coming full circle. And whether this indicates that Jesus just then learned that his time of departure would be at Jerusalem, or if it's something he already knew, again, we don't exactly know. But we see the importance of that that Jesus has a specific time and he has a specific purpose, and this is not exactly it. And so I think that's interesting. And again, this is the first thing that we hear Jesus say after God has said, listen to him. So, hey, disciples, remember, there is a purpose for going to Jerusalem. You may not like it. It may not be what you want or expect, but it is there. Okay, so that's kind of what's happening there. And in terms of the sermon itself, where I'm really thinking about going, I'm very much drawn to the notion of the big three almost sleeping through this amazing situation. And this isn't the only time that happens. Again, I mentioned the big three are pulled into a lot of special situations. In the garden, just before Jesus is betrayed, when he is praying, he takes the big three with him deeper in as well. Now, Luke doesn't actually specify that. He just says the disciples are with him in the garden, but we know from Matthew and Mark that he also takes Peter, James, and John with him deeper into the garden, and they fall asleep. So that time, there's no ambiguity. They literally fall asleep while Jesus is praying, and he's so anguished that he's sweating blood. We hear about that. So this once again, very important, deep situation. Their human frailty causes them to miss. And here at the Transfiguration, it almost does. And so my thought where I'm going with the sermon is asking the question of what is it that we are, quote unquote, sleeping through? What are the big things that God is maybe up to over here? And our needs or our weakness or our tiredness or whatever you want to say, whatever grabs our attention because of our weak human flawed bodies, what grabs our attention over here and keeps our attention so that we're missing over here? That's kind of what I'm going with in this notion. So if you have thoughts, questions, or comments, by all means share those down in the comment section. Always appreciate when those show up. Otherwise, you have a great week and God bless.